January 12, 1945, Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The transport truck rumbled through the main gates of the prisoner of war facility just as the sun began its descent behind the pine forests. Inside the canvas-covered bed, 43 German women sat in rigid silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms hanging loose on frames that had grown thinner with each passing month. They had been captured in France during the chaotic retreat of Wehrmacht forces, processed through temporary holding facilities in England, and now found themselves in the heart of the American South. A place so foreign it might as well have been another planet. 24-year-old Thea Zimmerman pressed her face against a small gap in the canvas, catching glimpses of the camp that would become their new home. She had served as a radio operator for the German military, believing she was contributing to her country's defense. Now she was simply prisoner number 4732, one of the few women among thousands of male prisoners scattered across America's vast prisoner of war system. The truck came to a halt with a metallic groan. American guards began unfastening the canvas covering, and cold Mississippi air rushed in. It was nothing like the bitter cold of a German winter, but to women who had spent weeks in unheated transport ships and trains, even this mild chill cut through their thin uniforms. Thea helped the woman beside her, 21-year-old Elfrida Bauer, who had been shivering for the past 3 hours despite the blanket they shared. Captain James Morrison, the officer in charge of the women's section of Camp Shelby, stood waiting as the prisoners climbed down from the truck. He had been briefed about this unusual group. Unlike the male prisoners who filled the rest of the camp, these women presented unique challenges. They needed separate housing, different security considerations, and perhaps most importantly, they needed someone who understood that, despite wearing enemy uniforms, they were still human beings far from home. The women lined up in formation, their military training evident even in exhaustion. Thea noticed how they all stood a certain way, shoulders back, despite their weariness, eyes forward, despite their fear. She recognized this posture because she wore it herself. It was armor, a way of maintaining dignity when everything else had been stripped away. 27-year-old Annalise Fisher stood near the end of the line, her hands clasped tightly together to stop them from shaking. She had worked in supply coordination, managing logistics for field hospitals. She had seen suffering, had witnessed the costs of war up close. But nothing had prepared her for the uncertainty of being a prisoner in a country she had been taught to fear and hate. Captain Morrison began to speak, but Thea barely heard the words. Her attention had been caught by something unexpected. From somewhere in the camp, she smelled food cooking, real. Food, the scent of meat and vegetables, and something she couldn't quite identify but which made her stomach clench with sudden, overwhelming hunger. She hadn't realized how long it had been since she had smelled anything like that. The women were led through the camp in single file, their worn boots crunching against gravel paths. Thea kept her eyes forward, but her peripheral vision caught details that contradicted everything she had been told about American prison camps. The barracks looked sturdy and well-maintained. Guards walked past without the menacing aggression she had expected. One even nodded politely as they passed, as if they were simply new arrivals rather than enemy prisoners. The women's section occupied a corner of the larger facility, separated by additional fencing, but not isolated. 3 wooden barracks had been prepared for them, each capable of housing 15 women. Inside, Thea found rows of metal bunks with actual mattresses, thin but present. There were blankets folded at the foot of each bed. A wood-burning stove sat in the center of the room, not yet lit, but ready for use. Elfrida stood beside her bunk, running her fingers across the rough wool blanket, as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. In the holding facility in France, they had slept on concrete floors with nothing but their coats for warmth. On the ship crossing the Atlantic, they had been packed into cargo holds where the cold seeped through every layer of clothing they possessed. Annalisa claimed a bunk near the stove, already calculating the best position for warmth during Mississippi's winter nights. Her practical mind, trained in logistics and supply management, automatically assessed their new environment. The barracks had windows with actual glass. The roof appeared sound. There were latrines nearby, basic but functional. By the standards of what they had endured over the past months, this place was almost luxurious. Lieutenant Sarah Williams, one of the few female officers assigned to Camp Shelby, entered the barracks carrying a clipboard. She was a tall woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that reminded Thea of her school teachers back in Munich. Through a translator, Lieutenant Williams explained the camp rules, the daily schedule, and what would be expected of them. But Thea found it difficult to concentrate on the words. Her mind kept drifting back to that smell of cooking food. How long had it been since she had eaten anything substantial? The rations in France had been meager, barely enough to sustain life. On the transport ship, they had received thin soup and hard bread once a day. She had grown accustomed to the constant hollow feeling in her stomach, the weakness in her limbs, the way her thoughts sometimes became fuzzy from lack of nourishment. She looked around at her fellow prisoners and saw the same gauntness reflected in every face. Elfrida's cheekbones protruded sharply beneath her pale skin. Annaliese's wrists looked like they might snap under the slightest pressure. They were all shadows of whoever they had been before the war, before the retreat, before the capture. Lieutenant Williams finished her speech and left them to settle in. The women moved slowly, unpacking their few possessions, claiming their spaces. No one spoke much. They were too tired, too uncertain, too overwhelmed by this strange new reality to find words that might make sense of it all. Evening approached, and with it came an announcement that would change everything. A guard appeared at the barracks door, gesturing for the women to follow. Dinner was ready in the mess hall. The women exchanged uncertain glances. They had expected to receive rations in their barracks, perhaps cold food passed through a window, the way prisoners were supposed to be fed. Instead, they were led to a large dining facility that served the entire women's section of the camp. Inside, long wooden tables had been set with metal trays and utensils. The room was warm, heated by large stoves at either end, and that smell, that incredible smell that Thea had noticed upon arrival, now filled the air so completely that she felt dizzy with hunger. Sergeant William Chen, who managed the kitchen staff, stood near the serving line. He was a second-generation Chinese-American who had grown up in his family's restaurant in San Francisco. He understood food not just as sustenance, but as communication, as comfort, as a way of showing care when words might fail. When he had learned that German women prisoners would be arriving, he had made a decision. He would feed them the way he would want someone to feed his own sisters if they were lost and far from home. The women lined up hesitantly, unsure of the protocol. Should they stand at attention? Should they wait for orders? But the American staff simply gestured them forward with encouraging smiles. One by one, they moved through the serving line, holding out their metal trays, while kitchen workers ladled food onto them. Thea stared at her tray in disbelief. A thick piece of bread, actual white bread, still warm from the oven. A serving of green beans that looked fresh, not canned or wilted. And in the center of her tray, filling the largest compartment, a generous portion of beef stew. She could see chunks of actual meat, potatoes, carrots, and rich brown gravy that steamed in the cool air. Elfrida stood frozen at the end of the serving line, her tray trembling in her hands. The young medical assistant had worked in field hospitals where she had watched soldiers and civilians alike slowly starve. She had learned to ignore her own hunger, to function on whatever scraps were available. But confronted with this abundance, something inside her cracked. Annalise found a seat at one of the long tables, her eyes never leaving the food on her tray. Around her, other women were sitting down, but none of them had begun eating yet. They seemed paralyzed by the sight of so much food, by the smell of it, by the impossibility of what they were seeing. In Germany, even before the war had turned desperate, they had not seen meals like this. During the war, such abundance had become nothing but a distant memory. The American guards and staff watched quietly, giving the women space to process this moment. Thea lifted her spoon with a hand that shook so badly she almost dropped it. The metal felt heavy in her grip, or perhaps it was simply that she had grown so weak that even this small implement seemed to require enormous effort. She dipped the spoon into the beef stew, watching as thick gravy coated the utensil. A piece of tender meat clung to the spoon along with chunks of potato and carrot. She brought it to her lips and tasted it. The flavor exploded across her tongue with such intensity that she gasped. It was hot, truly hot, not lukewarm or cold, like everything she had eaten for months. The meat was tender and seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify, but which tasted like something her mother might have cooked in their Munich kitchen a lifetime ago. The vegetables were soft, but not mushy, cooked with care by someone who understood food. Around her, other women were having their first bites. The room remained eerily silent except for the quiet sounds of spoons against metal trays. No one spoke. No one made eye contact. Each woman seemed locked in her own private experience of this meal, this impossible abundance that contradicted everything they had come to expect from their new reality as prisoners. Elfrida took her second spoonful and felt something shift inside her chest. It started as a tightness, a pressure building behind her breastbone. She tried to focus on eating, to be practical, and simply consume the nourishment her body desperately needed. But the third spoonful brought tears to her eyes. By the fourth, she was crying openly, tears streaming down her cheeks and dripping onto the tray in front of her. She wasn't alone. At tables throughout the mess hall, women were beginning to break down. Some cried silently, tears flowing while they continued to eat mechanically. Others sobbed aloud, their shoulders shaking with the force of emotions they had suppressed for so long. A few put down their spoons entirely, overwhelmed by feelings they couldn't name or control. Annalisa found herself weeping into her beef stew, unable to stop even though part of her mind recognized the absurdity of it. She was crying over food, simple, basic food that any American soldier probably ate without a second thought. But for her, for all of them, this meal represented something far more profound than mere sustenance. It was the first act of genuine kindness they had experienced in longer than they could remember. It was proof that they were still seen as human beings deserving of care rather than simply as enemies deserving of punishment. It was the taste of normalcy, of civilization, of a world where people cooked food with attention and served it with something approaching compassion. Captain Morrison stood at the edge of the mess hall, watching this unprecedented scene unfold. He had overseen the arrival of hundreds of prisoners during his time at Camp Shelby, but he had never witnessed anything like this. Sergeant Chen moved quietly between the tables, a large pot in his hands. He had seen the tears, the trembling shoulders, the way these women clutched their spoons like lifelines. His instinct told him to give them space, to let them process whatever emotions were surfacing. But his training in hospitality, learned in his family's restaurant, told him something else. These women needed more than space. They needed to understand that this wasn't a trick, that the kindness was real and would continue. He stopped beside Thea's table and gestured to her nearly empty bowl. She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes, not understanding his intention. He pointed to the pot he carried, then to her bowl, his meaning clear: more. There was more if she wanted it. Thea stared at him in disbelief. In every prison facility she had passed through, there had been exactly one portion per person. No seconds, no extras. Food was measured, rationed, controlled. The idea that she could have more, that there was enough to spare, seemed impossible. She glanced around nervously, wondering if this was some kind of test, a way to identify the greedy or the weak. But Sergeant Chen simply waited patiently, the ladle poised above her bowl. Finally, she nodded, unable to form words. He filled her bowl again, this portion as generous as the first, and moved on to the next woman. As he progressed through the mess hall, offering seconds to anyone who wanted them, the crying intensified. The simple act of abundance, of having enough and then more than enough, broke through defenses that months of hardship had erected. Elfrida accepted a second helping and found herself sobbing so hard she could barely eat it. The young woman beside her, a former clerk named Rosa, reached out and gripped her hand. They sat like that. Two strangers united by their uniforms and their captivity, holding hands while they cried and ate simultaneously. The combination felt absurd but also necessary, as if their bodies needed to release years of tension while their stomachs finally received proper nourishment. Annalise forced herself to eat slowly despite her body's screaming hunger. Her medical training, limited though it was, warned her about the dangers of eating too much too quickly after prolonged starvation. She had seen soldiers and civilians become violently ill when they suddenly had access to rich food after extended periods of deprivation. But even knowing this, it took all her willpower not to devour everything on her tray in desperate gulps. The bread was particularly overwhelming. She tore off small pieces, placing them on her tongue and letting them dissolve slowly. The texture was soft and yielding, nothing like the hard, moldy bread they had received on the transport ship. Someone had baked this bread today, perhaps even this afternoon. Someone had taken flour and yeast and water and created something wonderful, then given it to enemy prisoners without hesitation. Lieutenant Williams approached one of the tables where several women sat crying inconsolably. Private Daniel McCarthy had been assigned to guard duty at the women's section despite his initial reluctance. A farm boy from rural Georgia, he had never been around foreign women and wasn't sure how to handle prisoners who spoke no English and looked at him with a mixture of fear and defiance. But watching these women break down over a simple meal stirred something in him that transcended his discomfort. He noticed one woman sitting alone at the end of a table, her food untouched while tears streamed silently down her face. She was older than most of the others, perhaps in her early 30s, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of exhaustion beyond mere physical tiredness. Private McCarthy recognized that look. His own mother had worn it during the worst years of the Depression when keeping the farm meant going hungry more often than not. He approached her carefully, aware that his presence might frighten her, but she didn't look up, didn't seem to notice him at all. She simply stared at the food on her tray as if it were something she couldn't quite comprehend. He gestured to Lieutenant Williams, who came over with the German-speaking translator they had brought in from a nearby university. Through the translator, they learned her name was Margaret, and she hadn't eaten anything substantial in 6 weeks. She had been sick during most of the transport, unable to keep down even the meager rations provided. Now, confronted with real food, her body and mind seemed to have shut down completely. She wanted to eat, needed to eat, but couldn't make herself begin. Private McCarthy sat down across from her, something technically against protocol, but which felt necessary in the moment. He picked up his own dinner tray, which he had brought with him for his meal break, and began eating slowly. He took a bite of stew, chewed thoughtfully, swallowed. Then he tore off a piece of bread and ate that too. He was showing her, in the most basic way possible, that the food was safe, real, and meant to be consumed. Margaret watched him with hollow eyes. Slowly, tentatively, she picked up her own spoon. Her hand shook so violently that gravy sloshed over the side of her bowl. Private McCarthy continued eating his own meal, not watching her directly, but maintaining a calm, reassuring presence. After several long moments, she brought the spoon to her lips and took her first bite. The transformation was immediate. Her eyes widened, then filled with fresh tears. She took another bite, then another, and suddenly she was eating with desperate intensity, as if afraid the food might vanish if she didn't consume it quickly enough. Private McCarthy caught Lieutenant Williams's attention and nodded toward Margaret, silently communicating that someone should monitor her to make sure she didn't make herself sick. Around the mess hall, similar scenes were unfolding. Guards and staff members who had initially maintained their professional distance found themselves drawn into these moments of profound human need. That night, after the women had been escorted back to their barracks, Sleep came slowly despite their exhaustion. Thea lay on her bunk, her stomach fuller than it had been in months, and found herself transported back to memories she had tried to suppress. She remembered the winter of 1943 in Munich, when the rations had been cut again and again. Her mother had worked miracles with turnips and potatoes, stretching meager supplies to feed a family of 5. By 1944, even those desperate meals had become luxuries. Thea had joined the POW, Women's Auxiliary Corps, partly out of patriotic duty, but also because it meant regular meals, however sparse. The military fed its personnel before civilians, and she had watched her younger siblings grow thin while she received her soldier's ration. The guilt had eaten at her, but she had told herself it was temporary, that victory would bring abundance back to Germany. Instead, victory had moved further away with each passing month. The rations had grown smaller. The bread had been mixed with sawdust to make it stretch further. The soup had been mostly water with a few floating vegetables. And, through it all, the propaganda had insisted that Germany was winning, that the enemy was suffering worse, that sacrifice now would mean glory later. Elfrida stared at the ceiling of the barracks, her mind replaying the evening's meal in vivid detail. She had worked in a field hospital near Nuremberg, where she had watched soldiers and civilians alike waste away from malnutrition. She had held the hands of young men who weighed less than children, their bodies consuming themselves from the inside out. She had learned to ignore the constant growling of her own stomach, to function on adrenaline and duty when food was scarce. The medical staff had received slightly better rations than the patients, but even those had been inadequate. She remembered eating her daily portion of bread in tiny bites, making it last as long as possible, trying to trick her body into feeling satisfied. She remembered the taste of ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns, the bitterness of it, and how they had all pretended it was real coffee because the alternative was admitting how far they had fallen. The beef stew tonight had tasted like something from before the war, from a time when food was simply food, rather than a precious commodity to be hoarded and rationed. The abundance of it, the flavor, the warmth, had broken through her carefully constructed defenses. She had been trained to be strong, to be stoic, to serve without complaint. But that meal had reminded her that she was still human, still capable of being overwhelmed by simple kindness. Annalisa sat on her bunk, writing in a small notebook she had managed to keep throughout her capture. She had been keeping records, documenting everything she witnessed and experienced. As a supply coordinator, she understood the importance of accurate accounting, of tracking resources and outcomes. But tonight, her careful record-keeping dissolved into something more personal, more emotional. She wrote about the stew, describing it in detail she usually reserved for inventory lists. She wrote about the tears, both her own and those of her fellow prisoners. Morning came with the clang of a bell at 6 o'clock. The women rose slowly, their bodies stiff from months of poor nutrition and inadequate rest. But something had changed overnight. As they dressed and prepared for their first full day at Camp Shelby, conversations began to emerge. Quiet at first, hesitant, but present in a way they hadn't been during the journey to Mississippi. Thea found herself talking with a woman she had barely noticed the day before. Her name was Clara, a former nurse from Stuttgart who had worked alongside Annalisa in military hospitals. They spoke in German about the previous night's meal, about how strange it had felt to eat until they were genuinely full, about the guilt that accompanied such abundance when they knew people back home were starving. Breakfast proved to be another revelation. The women were led back to the mess hall where hot coffee awaited them. Real coffee, not the acorn substitute they had grown accustomed to. Alongside it came oatmeal with brown sugar, scrambled eggs, toast with butter and jam. Elfrida stood in the serving line, her tray filling with more food than she would have seen in a week in Germany, and felt tears threatening again. But this morning she managed to control them. The shock of abundance was still present, but no longer quite so overwhelming. She was beginning to understand that this wasn't a single act of kindness, but a pattern, a standard. This was how American prisoners were fed, routinely, daily, without ceremony or special occasion. The realization was almost more difficult to process than the previous night's emotional breakdown. Sergeant Chen watched the women eat with a cook's satisfaction. He had been up since 4 in the morning preparing breakfast for over 300 people across different sections of the camp. But he paid special attention to the women's section, making sure portions were generous, that the coffee was hot, that everything was prepared with care. His grandmother had taught him that food was more than sustenance. It was communication, comfort, connection. After breakfast, Lieutenant Williams assembled the women in the yard outside their barracks. Through the translator, she explained the camp's daily routine. There would be work assignments suited to their skills and training. Medical personnel would assist in the infirmary. Those with clerical experience would help with administrative tasks. Others would work in the kitchen, the laundry, or maintaining the camp facilities. They would be paid a small wage according to Geneva Convention requirements, though the amount was modest. But first, she explained, they would receive medical examinations to assess their overall health and ensure they received any necessary treatment. The women exchanged nervous glances. Medical examinations meant being vulnerable, being seen, being judged on their condition. Many of them knew they were severely underweight, that months of deprivation had taken a visible toll on their bodies. Thea was among the first group called for examination. She followed a guard to the camp infirmary, a clean, well-lit building that smelled of antiseptic and something else, something sweet she couldn't identify. Inside, she met Dr. Elizabeth Warner, one of the few female physicians in the U.S. Army Medical Corps. Dr. Warner was in her 40s, with gray-streaked hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Sergeant William Chen had grown up believing that food could bridge any divide. His parents had immigrated to San Francisco in 1921, opening a small restaurant that served both Chinese and American customers. He had learned to cook in that kitchen, watching his father adjust recipes to suit different palates, finding ways to make unfamiliar ingredients taste like home to people far from their birthplaces. When he had been drafted in 1943, he had expected to end up in combat. Instead, his culinary skills had landed him in the Army's food service program. He had been trained in mass cooking, in nutrition, in managing supplies, and feeding hundreds of soldiers efficiently. But he had never forgotten his father's essential lesson that food prepared with care could communicate respect, dignity, and compassion, even without words. The arrival of German women prisoners had presented him with an unexpected challenge. These weren't American soldiers he was feeding. They were enemies, technically, people whose country had started a war that had killed millions. Some of his fellow staff members had suggested that prisoners should receive minimal rations, basic sustenance, and nothing more. After all, hadn't Germans treated Allied prisoners poorly? Didn't they deserve the same treatment in return? But Sergeant Chen couldn't bring himself to view it that way. He saw women who looked like they had been starving for months, maybe years. He saw exhaustion and fear and desperation in their faces. And he remembered his grandmother's stories about being treated as less than human because of where she came from, how she looked, what language she spoke. He couldn't perpetuate that kind of cruelty, regardless of uniforms or national allegiances. So he had made beef stew, not the watered-down, barely flavored version that might have satisfied minimum requirements, but real stew made with quality ingredients and attention to flavor. He had used actual beef, not scraps or gristle. He had added vegetables that were fresh, not canned or wilted. He had seasoned it properly, creating something that would taste like comfort and care rather than obligation. Watching the women break down the previous night had confirmed his instincts. They weren't hardened soldiers or Nazi ideologues. They were young women who had been caught up in circumstances beyond their control, who had suffered deprivation and trauma, who needed basic human kindness as much as they needed food. This morning, he had prepared breakfast with the same philosophy. The oatmeal was properly cooked, not lumpy or burnt. The eggs were fresh, scrambled with real butter. The coffee was strong and hot, made from actual coffee beans rather than substitutes. He knew that every meal he prepared for these women was an opportunity to communicate something important, to show them that America's strength came not from cruelty, but from its ability to maintain humanity even toward enemies. Private McCarthy had sought him out after breakfast, wanting to talk about what had happened the previous night. The young Georgian was clearly struggling with his own reactions, trying to reconcile his hatred of Germany with his compassion for these particular Germans. "Sarge," he had said quietly, "I thought I'd feel different about feeding them. Thought I'd resent it, you know?" Dr. Warner's examination of Thea was thorough but gentle. She measured height and weight, noting numbers that made her frown with concern. Thea weighed 93 pounds at 5 feet 6 inches tall. Her ribs were visible beneath her skin, her collarbones protruded sharply, and her arms looked like they might snap under pressure. The doctor checked her reflexes, listened to her heart and lungs, examined her hair and nails for signs of nutritional deficiency. Through the translator, Dr. Warner asked questions about Thea's medical history, about what rations she had received over the past year, about any illnesses or injuries she had suffered. Thea answered as honestly as she could, describing the progressive deterioration of food quality and quantity in Germany, the near-starvation conditions during the retreat through France, the inadequate rations on the transport ship. The doctor made notes on her clipboard, her expression neutral, but her eyes conveying something that looked like sympathy. When the examination concluded, she spoke through the translator with careful deliberation. Thea was severely malnourished, but not beyond recovery. She would need time, proper nutrition, and rest to regain her health. The sudden abundance of food needed to be approached carefully to avoid overwhelming her digestive system, which had adapted to chronic deprivation. Similar examinations were conducted throughout the morning. Elfrida learned she weighed 87 pounds, dangerously underweight for her 5'4" frame. Annalisa, taller and naturally larger boned, still weighed only 108 pounds. Every single woman examined showed signs of malnutrition, ranging from moderate to severe. Dr. Warner compiled her findings into a comprehensive report that would shock Captain Morrison when he read it later that afternoon. But the physical examinations revealed more than just nutritional deficiency. They showed the human cost of prolonged deprivation, the way bodies adapted and survived, but at tremendous expense. Several women had lost teeth. Others showed signs of scurvy from lack of vitamin C. Many had irregular heartbeats, thinning hair, brittle nails, and skin conditions caused by vitamin deficiencies. Dr. Warner met with Sergeant Chen after completing the examinations. She explained that while the women needed substantial nutrition to recover, their systems couldn't handle too much. Rich food too quickly. They needed to gradually increase their caloric intake over several weeks, focusing on nutrient-dense foods that would rebuild their depleted reserves without overwhelming their compromised digestive systems. Sergeant Chen listened carefully and began planning modified menus. He would continue providing generous portions, but adjust the recipes to be less rich initially. More vegetables, leaner proteins, easily digestible starches. As the women's bodies adapted and strengthened, he would gradually introduce richer foods. It was a delicate balance between providing adequate nutrition and avoiding digestive distress. That afternoon, work assignments began. Thea was assigned to administrative duties, helping process paperwork and organize files. Her education and her rapidly improving English made her valuable for tasks requiring literacy and attention to detail. Elfrida was sent to the infirmary to assist Dr. Warner and the nursing staff. Her medical training, though limited, was more than most people possessed, and her gentle manner with patients was immediately apparent. Annalise found herself working in the supply department, exactly where her experience and skills were most applicable. Evening brought another substantial meal. Roasted chicken with potatoes and green beans, fresh bread with butter, and for dessert, apple cobbler that made several women weep again. But this time, the tears were quieter, more controlled. They were beginning to adapt to abundance, though the guilt that accompanied it remained sharp and present. After dinner, Lieutenant Williams announced that the women would be allowed to write letters home. The International Red Cross would facilitate delivery through neutral channels, though she cautioned that mail service to Germany was unreliable at best. Many letters never arrived. Responses, if they came at all, might take months, but for women who had no way of knowing whether their families were alive or dead, the possibility of contact was precious beyond measure. Thea returned to her bunk with paper and pencil, staring at the blank page for nearly an hour before she could bring herself to write. What could she possibly say? How could she explain where she was, what she was experiencing, without revealing the uncomfortable truth that she was being treated better as an American prisoner than she had been as a German soldier? She finally began writing to her mother, keeping her language careful and neutral. She explained that she had been captured and was now in a prisoner of war camp in America. She was safe and healthy. She hoped everyone at home was managing as well as possible. She asked for news about her siblings, about neighbors, about anyone who might still be there. She didn't mention the food or the kindness or the way her entire understanding of America was being challenged by daily reality. Elfrida wrote to an aunt in Nuremberg, the only family member she thought might still be at the same address. Her parents had been killed in an air raid in 1944, and her younger brother had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and disappeared somewhere on the Eastern Front. The aunt was elderly and had no other family. Elfrida wrote cheerfully, trying to provide comfort and hope, but her tears spotted the paper as she described how much she missed home. Annalisa wrote to no one. She had received word through the Red Cross months ago that her entire family had perished when their neighborhood in Stuttgart was destroyed by Allied bombing. She had no one waiting for her in Germany, no one who would care whether she survived the war or not. The realization had been devastating at the time, but now it carried a different weight. Without family ties pulling her back, she was free to consider possibilities she might not have otherwise entertained. Around the barracks, women wrote with varying degrees of hope and despair. Some poured their hearts onto paper, desperate to connect with loved ones they might never see again. Others wrote brief, factual letters that revealed nothing of their emotional state. A few, like Annalisa, wrote nothing at all because there was no one left to write to. Private McCarthy collected the letters later that evening, promising they would be processed through proper channels. As he gathered the envelopes, he noticed how many of them were tear-stained, how the handwriting wavered with emotion. These women were trying to reach across an ocean and through a war to touch home one more time. The following days established a routine that began to feel almost normal. Wake at 6, breakfast at 7, work assignments from 8 until noon, lunch, more work until 5, dinner at 6, free time until lights out at 10. The women adapted to the schedule quickly, grateful for the structure and the sense of purpose that came with useful work. But conversations during meals and free time began to reveal uncomfortable truths that many of the women had been avoiding. As their English improved through daily interaction with American staff, they started asking questions about what they were eating, where the food came from, how much was typically available. The answers shocked them. Thea learned that the meals they were receiving represented standard American military rations, not special treatment for prisoners. Every soldier in the U.S. Army ate similar food. Moreover, American civilians back home, despite wartime rationing, had access to far more food than Germans had seen even before the war intensified. The propaganda about America suffering under deprivation, about their economy collapsing, about their people starving, had been complete fabrications. Elfrida asked Dr. Warner during one of her shifts in the infirmary about American food production. The doctor explained that America's agricultural system was so efficient that the country produced more than enough to feed its own population while also supplying food to Allied forces around the world. The shortages that Germans had been told were crippling. America simply didn't exist on any comparable scale. The realization was deeply unsettling. These women had endured years of increasing hunger, had watched their families and neighbors grow gaunt and desperate, had been told that everyone was suffering equally, that the enemy was suffering more. Now they were discovering that the suffering had been largely one-sided, that Germany's population had been systematically starved while being told lies about the abundance that existed elsewhere. Annalise, with her supply management background, began asking more detailed questions about American logistics. How did they transport so much food? How did they store it? How did they ensure quality and prevent spoilage? The American staff, surprised by her technical interest, provided answers that revealed a level of organizational sophistication and resource abundance that made Germany's supply system look primitive by comparison. One evening, Sergeant Chen invited several of the German women into the kitchen to help with dinner preparation. It was partly practical. He needed extra hands during a busy period, but also educational. He wanted them to see exactly what went into creating their meals, to understand that the abundance wasn't magic, but the result of good systems and adequate resources. Thea found herself peeling potatoes alongside Private McCarthy, who had become something of a friendly presence in their daily lives. He talked while they worked, describing his family's farm in Georgia, how they grew crops, raised livestock, sent food to markets throughout the South. His descriptions of ordinary American agricultural life revealed productivity that would have seemed miraculous in wartime Germany. February brought warmer weather to Mississippi, and with it, subtle changes in the dynamics between prisoners and guards. The rigid formality of the first weeks began to soften as daily interactions created unexpected friendships. Thea found herself looking forward to morning shifts in the administrative office, where she worked alongside Corporal Jennifer Hayes, a secretary from Ohio, who spoke slowly and clearly to help Thea improve her English. They communicated through a mixture of words, gestures, and gradually genuine conversation. Corporal Hayes told stories about her hometown, about her family's business, about why she had joined the military. Thea listened, learning not just English vocabulary but American perspectives, American values, American ways of understanding the world. In return, she began sharing her own stories, carefully at first about Munich before the war, about her family, about the life she had known before everything changed. Elfrieda's work in the infirmary brought her into daily contact with Dr. Warner, whose patient teaching transformed the young German woman's basic medical knowledge into more sophisticated skills. The doctor treated her not as an enemy prisoner, but as a student, explaining procedures, demonstrating techniques, trusting her with increasingly complex responsibilities. This trust meant more to Elfrieda than any words of kindness could have conveyed. One afternoon, an American soldier was brought into the infirmary with a badly sprained ankle. He was young, perhaps 19, and clearly nervous about being treated by a German prisoner, but Elfrieda's gentle efficiency, as she helped Dr. Warner wrap his ankle, gradually eased his tension. By the end of the treatment, he thanked her directly, his eyes reflecting surprise at finding compassion from someone wearing an enemy uniform. Annalisa discovered that her supply management skills made her indispensable to the camp's logistics operations. Lieutenant Charles Weber, who oversaw supply distribution, began relying on her organizational abilities and attention to detail. She redesigned their inventory system, implemented more efficient tracking procedures, and identified ways to reduce waste. Her contributions were acknowledged not with grand praise, but with increasing responsibility, which she valued far more. The meals continued to serve as focal points for connection and transformation. Sergeant Chen expanded his informal cooking lessons, showing interested prisoners how to prepare various American dishes. Thea learned to make cornbread, a Southern staple she had never encountered before. The process of measuring, mixing, baking, and then sharing the results with others created moments of normalcy that transcended their circumstances. Private McCarthy brought his harmonica to the mess hall one evening and played folk songs while the women ate dinner. The music created an atmosphere of relaxation and community that felt almost impossible given the reality of their situation. Several German women began humming along, and one boldly asked if she could try playing the instrument. McCarthy handed it over without hesitation, and soon they were taking turns producing terrible sounds and laughing together at their collective lack of musical talent. These small moments accumulated into something larger. Trust built gradually through shared work, shared meals, shared laughter. The women began to see their American captors not as abstract enemies, but as individual people. March brought news from Europe that forced the women to confront truths they had been avoiding. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, reports began filtering back about what they were discovering: concentration camps, mass graves, industrial-scale atrocities that defied comprehension. The American newspapers available in the camp library carried photographs and accounts that made Thea physically ill when she read them. She sat at one of the library tables, staring at images from Bergen-Belsen, from Dachau, from places she had never heard of, but which apparently existed in the country she had proudly served. Her hands trembled as she read descriptions of systematic murder, of deliberate starvation, of cruelty so profound it seemed impossible that human beings could inflict it on other human beings. Elfrida found her there, tears streaming down both their faces as they looked at the evidence of what their country had done. They had known the war was brutal. They had seen suffering up close in field hospitals and during the chaotic retreat. But this was something different, something planned and executed with bureaucratic efficiency. This wasn't the fog of war or the heat of battle. This was calculated evil on a scale neither of them could have imagined. Other women gathered around the newspapers, their reactions ranging from shock to denial to anguished guilt. Some insisted the reports must be exaggerated, that Allied propaganda was making things look worse than they were. But the photographs didn't lie. The testimony of American soldiers who had liberated the camps didn't lie. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Annalise read the reports with a supply coordinator's eye, noting the logistics required to carry out such operations. Trains, camps, administrative systems, all organized to facilitate mass murder. Her professional mind understood exactly what kind of planning and resources would have been necessary. The realization that Germany's supply networks she had been part of, had been used for this purpose, made her physically sick. That evening, Captain Morrison called a special assembly. Through translators, he addressed the German women directly, acknowledging that they had likely seen the news reports from Europe. He spoke carefully, aware that this was a delicate moment that could either destroy the fragile trust they had been building or potentially strengthen it through honest confrontation with difficult truths. He told them that he didn't hold them personally responsible for crimes they hadn't committed and likely hadn't known about. But he also said that ignorance didn't erase the reality of what had been done in their country's name. The women would need to wrestle with what this meant for their identities, their beliefs, their understanding of who they had been and who they wanted to become. His words were firm but not cruel, honest but not vindictive. He acknowledged that most of them had probably been ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances, but he also challenged them to choose consciously what they would believe going forward, to reject propaganda and hatred, to commit to being better than what Germany had become. Despite the heavy burden of the revelations from Europe, or perhaps because of them, something shifted among the German women during late March. Having confronted the worst truths about their country, they began to embrace more fully the possibility of transformation that their American captivity offered. The contrast between the cruelty revealed in those newspaper reports and the kindness they experienced daily at Camp Shelby became impossible to ignore. Thea noticed the change in herself first. She caught her reflection in a window one morning and realized she was smiling. Actually smiling, not the tight-lipped grimace she had worn for months, but a genuine expression of something approaching contentment. She had gained weight, her cheeks were no longer hollow, and her eyes had lost some of their haunted quality. The physical transformation mirrored an internal one she was only beginning to understand. Elfrida found joy in her medical work, discovering that helping others gave her a sense of purpose that had been missing during her service in Germany. She no longer saw herself primarily as a prisoner or even as a German, but as someone useful, someone capable of contributing positively to the world around her. Dr. Warner had become not just a supervisor, but a mentor, encouraging her to consider continuing her medical education after the war. The question of what came after the war had begun to dominate conversations among the women. Repatriation seemed inevitable eventually, but many of them dreaded the prospect of returning to the devastated country Germany was becoming. The women who had received letters from home shared descriptions of cities in ruins, families scattered, food shortages that made their own earlier suffering look modest by comparison. Annalisa, who had no family waiting for her, began to contemplate possibilities that would have seemed unthinkable months earlier. What if she didn't return to Germany? What if she tried to stay in America, to build a new life in a country that had shown her more kindness as an enemy prisoner than her own country had shown her as a loyal citizen? She wasn't alone in these thoughts. Conversations during evening free time revealed that many of the women were asking similar questions. They had experienced transformation during their captivity, had been exposed to different values and ways of living, had discovered that the enemy they had been taught to hate was capable of remarkable compassion. Going back to Germany meant leaving all of that behind. Sergeant Chen organized a special dinner for Easter, preparing a feast that included ham, roasted vegetables, fresh bread, and for dessert, chocolate cake that made several women openly weep with pleasure. The meal had taken on ceremonial significance beyond mere sustenance. It represented acceptance, community, the possibility of renewal and rebirth that the Easter season symbolized. Private McCarthy played his harmonica again, and this time several of the German women sang along in their accented English. May 8, 1945 arrived with news that changed everything. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Across America, celebrations erupted in streets and town squares. At Camp Shelby, the atmosphere was more subdued, complicated by the presence of thousands of German prisoners, who had just learned that their country had been utterly defeated. Captain Morrison called an assembly of the women prisoners to announce the news officially and to explain what it meant for their future. Repatriation procedures would begin soon, though the logistics of returning thousands of prisoners across an ocean would take time to organize. They should prepare themselves mentally and emotionally for the journey home to whatever remained of Germany. But as he spoke, Morrison noticed something unexpected in the women's faces. Instead of relief at the prospect of going home, he saw fear, uncertainty, even something that looked like grief. These women had spent 4 months at Camp Shelby, 4 months of regular meals and decent treatment, 4 months of discovering that America was nothing like what they had been taught. Now they were being told to leave this place and return to a country that existed only in ruins. That evening, Thea sat with Elfrida and Annalise in the barracks, speaking in hushed German about the impossible choice they faced. Return to Germany meant confronting the devastation directly, meant facing the judgment of those who had remained, meant trying to rebuild lives in a country that had been physically and morally destroyed. But staying, even if it were possible, meant abandoning their homeland when it needed them most. Elfrida voiced what others were thinking. What if they asked to stay? What if they requested permission to remain in America rather than accept repatriation? The idea seemed absurd at first. Prisoners of war didn't refuse freedom. They didn't choose captivity over liberation. But the more they discussed it, the more the idea took root in their minds. Annalise pointed out the practical challenges. They had no legal status in America beyond being prisoners. They had no sponsors, no jobs waiting, no clear path to immigration, even if the authorities agreed to let them stay. But she also noted that they had skills, education, and 4 months of demonstrated reliability. They had built relationships with Americans who might be willing to vouch for them. Over the next week, similar conversations occurred throughout the women's barracks. Some felt strongly that their duty lay in returning to help rebuild Germany. Others felt equally strongly that they could serve better by remaining in America, by becoming living examples of reconciliation and transformation. The debate grew intense at times, with accusations of cowardice and selfishness exchanged between those who wanted to stay and those committed to returning home. Thea found herself torn between loyalty to a country that no longer existed in the form she had known, and gratitude toward a country that had treated her with unexpected humanity. She thought about her family in Munich, wondered if they were still alive, if they needed her, but she also thought about Corporal Hayes, about Dr. Warner, about Sergeant Chen. June 20th arrived with a heaviness that permeated the entire camp. The transport arrangements had been finalized. In 3 days, the German women would board trucks that would take them to the port in New Orleans, then to ships bound for Europe. Captain Morrison had granted them a final evening of relative freedom, a farewell dinner that Sergeant Chen had been planning for weeks. The mess hall had been decorated with simple flowers picked from around the camp. Tables had been arranged differently, creating a more intimate setting than the usual institutional rows. American staff who had worked closely with the German women had been invited to join them for this final meal, an unprecedented breaking of the usual separation between prisoners and guards. Sergeant Chen had prepared his most ambitious menu yet. Roasted turkey with stuffing, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, almondine, fresh rolls with butter, and for dessert, apple pie that he had learned was a quintessentially American dish. He wanted this meal to represent everything he believed about food as communication, as connection, as a way of saying things that words couldn't quite capture. As the women entered the decorated mess hall, many of them openly wept. This room had been the site of their transformation, the place where they had first experienced American kindness, where they had broken down over beef stew 4 months earlier. Now it was the setting for their goodbye to a chapter of their lives that had changed them in ways they were still trying to understand. Thea sat between Corporal Hayes and Elfrida, feeling pulled in 2 directions simultaneously. Part of her wanted desperately to stay, to continue the life she had begun building here. But another part felt the pull of duty, of family, of homeland despite everything. She had spent the past week wrestling with this choice and still hadn't reached a definitive answer. Elfrida had made her decision. She would return to Germany, would try to find her aunt if the woman still lived, would use her medical skills to help whoever needed them in the devastated country. Dr. Warner had written her a letter of recommendation, praising her abilities and character, hoping it might help her find medical work in Germany. The 2 women had embraced tearfully that morning, both knowing they would likely never see each other again. Annalise had also decided, but in the opposite direction. She would ask permission to stay. With no family waiting for her in Germany, she felt free to choose a different path. Lieutenant Weber had already indicated he would sponsor her application to remain in America, would help her navigate the complex immigration procedures that might allow her to stay legally. As dinner was served, Captain Morrison stood to address the gathering. He spoke about the past 4 months, about how a group of women who had arrived as enemies had become something else through daily interactions, shared work, and mutual respect. He acknowledged that the situation had been unusual, perhaps unprecedented, but that it had taught everyone involved important lessons. Private McCarthy played his harmonica one final time, choosing melodies that carried both sadness and hope. June 20th, 1965. New York City, Thea Zimmerman Morrison stood in the kitchen of her Brooklyn apartment, preparing beef stew according to a recipe she had learned 20 years earlier in a Mississippi prison camp. Her husband, Private Daniel McCarthy, who had brought her second helpings on her first night at Camp Shelby, was setting the table for their dinner guests. Their 2 children, Emma and James, were helping by folding napkins and arranging silverware. The doorbell rang, and Thea wiped her hands on her apron before answering. Standing in the hallway was Elfriede Bauer, now Dr. Elfriede Bauer, visiting from Munich, where she directed a hospital that specialized in treating malnutrition and trauma. Beside her stood Anneliese Fischer-Weber, who had indeed stayed in America, married Lieutenant Charles Weber, and now worked for the State Department coordinating aid programs to post-war Germany. The 3 women embraced with the easy affection of sisters, though they looked nothing alike and came from different corners of Germany. What united them was the shared experience of that winter and spring in Mississippi, when they had learned that enemies could become friends, that kindness could transcend hatred, that transformation was possible even in the darkest circumstances. Over dinner, they told their children about that first meal of beef stew, about crying over food because it represented more than sustenance. They talked about Sergeant Chen, who had passed away 5 years earlier, but whose cooking had communicated dignity and respect when words would have failed. They remembered Captain Morrison, Lieutenant Williams, Dr. Warner, all the Americans who had chosen to treat them as human beings rather than simply as enemies. Elfriede described her work in Germany, how she had spent 2 decades helping rebuild her country's medical infrastructure, treating patients who had survived the concentration camps, working toward healing and reconciliation. Her experience at Camp Shelby had taught her that redemption was possible, that past actions didn't have to define future identity. Anneliese talked about her work coordinating aid to Germany through the Marshall Plan and subsequent programs. She had become a bridge between the 2 countries, using her unique perspective as someone who had lived on both sides to facilitate understanding and cooperation. She had never regretted her choice to stay in America, though she visited Germany regularly and maintained deep connections to her homeland. Thea, who had initially returned to Germany but later immigrated to America with Daniel's help, reflected on how that meal 20 years ago had changed the trajectory of her entire life. She had discovered in that Mississippi prison camp that home wasn't just where you were born, but where you chose to build a life based on values you believed in. The beef stew that evening tasted exactly as it had in 1945. The recipe was simple, but its significance remained profound. It represented the moment when 3 young women had learned that humanity could transcend national boundaries, that kindness was a choice, that forgiveness was possible when accompanied by genuine transformation.